Hey gang, your old buddy Clay here. I'm really excited today. We are going to do a comparison of the Epiphone inspired by Gibson Custom Les Paul Custom and the Gibson Les Paul Custom. Let's check it out. Okay gang, just want to take a second and chat with you real quick about the Epiphone inspired by Les Paul Custom. First, I'm going to try to make this a little different than some of my other videos. Basically, with the other videos, I shoved two sort of guitars into sort of one review, but really they're separate reviews that are just kind of packed together. I'm going to try to do this in a little different fashion. I'm going to do just a quick compare and contrast on these two. And then of course by the end, we'll take a listen and see how they both sound in comparison to one another. And we'll go from there. So, gang, first up, Epiphone Les Paul Custom from the Inspired by Gibson Custom range. Very cool guitar, honestly. It's pretty light, all things considered. I haven't weighed this specific example, but I think these typically have been running lately in about the high 8 range, which is almost primo for a Les Paul with no weight relief. So you know that you've really got like a good quality body and neck wood here as far as the type of mahogany that is used. Now, I do believe that it's probably a little bit different mahogany sourced from another place than like Gibson USA or Gibson Custom may source their tone woods from, but nevertheless, all the right components are still here. So, this being from the Epiphone inspired by Gibson Custom range, this is to mimic the current non-reissue Les Paul Custom that you can buy now. So, what I mean by that is this is not a recreation of a 57 reissue or 68 reissue. This is a recreation of the Les Paul Custom that sort of got brought over from the Gibson USA line. So what I mean by that is you have a maple top here, you have a rounded neck profile here, whereas like a 57, which a 57 would have a rounded neck profile too, I guess, but a 57 wouldn't have a maple top, it would have an all mahogany body and top. But past that, you still get the double bound, multiply binding all the way around, multiply binding on the headstock, just a bunch of cool stuff with this. So you also get, of course, Mallory capacitors, Switchcraft switch, and jack, and you also get Gibson 490 and 490 AT pickups, which you will also find in the Gibson Les Paul Custom. So with this, you have some cool features here, really. So without further ado, let's talk about some of the similarities and differences in between the both of these when you're talking about how do these guitars compare to one another. I believe the Gibson Les Paul Custom now is in the $5,400 range. This is $1,299. How much of that $5,400 guitar do you get for $1,299? And I think you might be surprised at the similarities between these two guitars. So you get a stamped serial number on the back here with the sort of double diamond inspired by Gibson Custom logo on the back. I do think it's a neat touch to have these stamped into the back of the headstock. Just a good look. You get gold hardware, of course, all the way up and down, Grover tuners. Now, I will say this, you can see that these are sort of the standard kidney bean tuning machines that are on here, the actual heads themselves. Whereas if you get a Gibson Les Paul Custom, you're probably looking at sort of that tulip shape or keystone, some people may refer to it as, with those Grover tuners. So you get that front profile like you would get with a Gibson standard Les Paul or an SG with that look, that sort of silhouette. This 2-point truss rod cover here, which is standard Gibson fare. You know, if you're a Gibson fanatic, you like Gibson guitars, or just kind of know how to spot differences in fakes or the differences between Epiphone and Gibson, etc. You'll see it's got the Gibson Les Paul Custom 2-point truss rod cover here. One thing I do actually like about the truss rod cover on this one is that they did use the wide bevel. It's a 3-point truss rod cover, and that's basically due to the design, the manufacturing process that goes into installing the truss rod into an Epiphone neck versus a Gibson neck. There's no room here to put that sort of second screw in the middle, so it has to be on each side of where the truss rod actually goes down in. I actually try to get you guys a shot of that right now to kind of give you a comparison between the two. And I'm actually going to get you a lot of double shots of these guitars too, like right together, so you can sort of easily spot those differences. Now, full disclosure, the Gibson Les Paul here to my right is a 2013 model. And there are a couple of spec differences there between that and this guitar. Pickups and hardware haven't really changed since then, but the fretboard on the Gibson Les Paul Custom, and I'm not even sure if I can get you that with the quality of camera that I'm using, but that fretboard is Richlite. So that was sort of something that was being used from, I think, 2011-ish to 2018, when Gibson was having a kind of an exotic tone woods issue with rosewood, ebony being very scarce. They weren't able to get those sourced quite as easily. This basically is totally black, so they decided to use Richlite. As far as fretboards go, I think it's fine. And as for tonal qualities, I'm not really terribly sure how much the fretboard actually affects the tone more than it affects the feel. And this does feel very sort of slick, although if you did a lot of string cleaning, a lot of playing, Ebony may feel just as slick to you. But this does have a Richlite fingerboard, whereas the Epiphone does indeed have an honest-to-goodness Ebony fingerboard here. So if you're even talking used prices, you know, you're looking at $3,000 plus for sort of this era of Les Paul. In most cases, maybe not all, your mileage may vary where you live, right? But if you're looking at used prices, you're still in that $3,000 plus-ish territory versus $1,299 for one of these brand new. And this actually has an Ebony fingerboard, whereas, you know, a used one may not, depending on the year. So I think that's a cool, interesting sort of spec comparison. Now, that being said, if you get a brand new Les Paul Custom at $54,000-ish or $100 rather, you're going to be getting an Ebony fingerboard with that now too. So the specs are pretty much right on. They're the same. Switchcraft switch, Mallory capacitors. And overall, when you're talking about the body thickness on this, I think it's a very, very sparse difference. It's 2-inch body thickness on the Les Paul Custom, and it's like 1.94 here. That may be a little bit thicker with the extra binding, and that applies for both guitars. But I know if you're comparing standards, you know, especially I guess since Epiphone is using the metric system sort of to measure out a lot of things where they're made overseas, that's probably where some of that discrepancy lies. But anyway, the Epiphone is a little tiny bit thinner than the Gibson model. So there's that. Now, I think the biggest differences between the two guitars here when you're talking about these models are the bridges. So the Epiphone has an ABR1 style bridge, but it's not sort of, it sort of is and it sort of isn't. It's still kind of that narrower bridge with the wire retainer, but it does go into bushings that are in the body, and that's sort of how you get, you know, that contact to be made there. And it also has a lock tone tailpiece, which I think is pretty handy for string changes, things of that nature. Because once you take the strings off, this is not just going to fall loose like some, you know, standard sort of tailpieces will. So it'll kind of stay in place. You can, and by that occurring, you sort of keep your bridge in place, and it's just easier to get the string change done a little quicker without having to worry about keeping that mounted. Although most of the time that's really not going to happen anyway, because you're going to have it laid out on a table. But again, depending on your situation, your mileage may vary on that. Now, going back up here to the fretboard, you are capped off here with mother of pearl inlays, big block inlays from the first fret pretty much all the way up the register. And the same is gonna apply with the Gibson on that aspect as well. You still have mother of pearl inlays, big blocks all the way up and down. I don't really see a ton of difference visually between the two of them, but I'm gonna get you a close-up shot and you guys tell me what you think down in the comments below. Hey, while we're here and I've got you here, give us a like and a subscribe and check out more content from Mountain Music Exchange. Hit that bell, get notifications, and just hang with the gang. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program. So, the Gibson model is going to come with 490, 498T pickups, which is what the Epiphone model will come with as well. And, you know, some people say those pickups are imbalanced or they sort of scoff at them or whatever, but fact of the matter is, they've been putting these in the Gibson Les Paul Custom since the late 80s or early 90s. So they've been kind of a mainstay with this particular model for quite a long time. Now, one thing I've noticed in difference in this, and I've noticed it also with an earlier review we did with a couple of Kirk Hammett models from Gibson and Epiphone, the neck taper on this is definitely more noticeable than on the Epiphone. It starts out sort of thin. I'm actually inclined to say this is a thinner neck altogether. It's still rounded, but the taper gets much bigger and much more rounded as you get closer to the higher end of the register here. And it sort of stays a little more uniform with the Epiphone. It's much more rounded, much more sort of uniform. It does still taper, but it is much bigger here. I'm just inclined to say that this is a bigger neck in general. I think this is probably more based on a 50s neck, and at least this example of the Gibson is probably more based around a 60s neck if I were gonna guess. If it's based around a 50s, it is the loosest possible definition of a 50s neck for this example that I could think of, right? Moving forward, you've still got speed knobs here. Everything else aesthetically is pretty much the same. You got the big split diamond mother of pearl in both. And on the Epiphone, of course, on the back, you have this cool Epiphone inspired by Gibson Custom logo on the plate that goes over the route for the knobs, input jack, etc. And on this one, of course, you've got Gibson Custom here. Most of these will come with like a Gibson Custom switch plate right here, but you can also optionally, you know, it'll come with it in the case or whatever, just a black one if you prefer that. Of course, I think most people probably prefer to flash their Gibson Custom, and I can't say I blame them, I'm among them, so I get it. But yeah. Oh, and back to the bridges. This one, the Gibson model, and to this day too, although this is a bit older one, the spec hasn't changed. This one has the Nashville style bridge, so it's a little bit more mass, a little bit more movement. You know, if you're working your intonation, you're not going to run out of room quite as quickly, but this one still does have, in the same vein as the Epiphone and other sort of Gibson USA models, does have the posts that go into a bushing sort of, you know, so it's not in any respect an ABR1 bridge, but it is a really well done Tune-o-matic style bridge. I don't really, some people have a preference for these sorts of things, you know, people have to have sort of the ABR1. I don't know if that's necessarily for like historical accuracy, or they just genuinely prefer it. They genuinely prefer the tonal difference in an ABR1, for example. I do get the point of a real ABR1 because the post goes straight into the body, so that's that vibration going all the way through the wood, nothing sort of in between. But I've noticed in practical use, I don't really have a preference for either one of them, to be honest with you. I don't, I like both. I don't prefer one over the other, so there's that. This one is a little bit modified. It does have like a strap lock system. However, typically they'll come with like your standard sort of small Gibson style, vintage style, you know, strap buttons that go here and here. And if I just have to make a recommendation, quite frankly, I would recommend to anyone to get a bigger strap button if you actually plan on taking this out and playing it. Maybe keeping your old strap buttons for, you know, anything if you're worried about value being affected, etc. But definitely increase the size of these suckers. You do not want to lose your Les Paul on stage at your house or anywhere else. And the Epiphone is just going to come sort of with standard Epiphone style strap buttons. I actually still recommend probably getting bigger strap buttons, but these are a little more sort of tapered outward and are still probably better as strap buttons than your standard vintage style Gibson strap button, which quite frankly scared me to death. Right, so one more thing, I seem to always fail to mention these details in other Les Paul videos I've done. I'm not sure where I fall into the camp of long neck tenons, for example. You know, some people swear by them. They swear it's the only way that the Les Paul sounds like a Les Paul. I'm not so sure. I've played plenty of Les Pauls that sounded pretty Les Paul-y without them, but both of these guitars, that's going to be the Gibson and the Epiphone inspired by Gibson Custom, do indeed have the long neck tenon that comes underneath the pickup here to set the neck into the body. So if the long neck tenon is your preference, both guitars have it. All right, so other than the bridge, really, just a quick little, you know, sort of summary follow-up before we get going any farther here. We plug these things up. Just a quick summary, the only real big differences that are noticeable, other than of course that big Epiphone logo there that's the giveaway, and the 3-point truss rod cover. The only real noticeable difference is if you just put these side by side, which I'm gonna do and show you right now, the only big differences are sort of the bridge visually. The bridge, the 3-point truss rod cover, and the Epiphone logo. Of course, on these two examples, the strap buttons are gonna be different, and they're gonna be different if you were to have just a brand new shiny example of a factory Gibson Les Paul Custom here as well, so that would be another noticeable difference. If you guys see any other noticeable differences here that I'm missing, just let me know in the comments below. I've already got fret nibs on that list, by the way. This one does not have the fret nibs, which is the binding coming up over the frets, meaning that the binding was put on after sort of the fret finishing process has occurred. And it keeps those frets from sprouting out at you. That being said, these frets don't seem to do that at all here. I don't seem to have any trouble running strings over the frets and getting any sort of weird noises, anything hanging up on me or anything like that. So there's that. Whereas the Gibson Les Paul Custom does indeed have fret nibs. So I guess the question is, how much of that $12.99, how close are you? Now, minus some other factors, you know, some folks are probably gonna say, like made in USA and that sort of thing. So let's just take that sort of out and just talk about spec for spec. Your price point's not $5,500, right? You're somewhere, you've got $1,500 or below, and you say, I want a black Gibson Les Paul Custom, which for the record is my dream guitar, and I'm very happy to have this in my hands right now. I cannot stress to you enough how much I really like this guitar. That being said, you've got under $1,500, you say, I need a black Les Paul Custom. That's my look, that's my sound. What am I gonna do? There's absolutely nothing wrong if you wanna grab the Epiphone Les Paul Custom from the Inspired by Gibson Custom range. You are gonna get a very big percentage of that Gibson Les Paul Custom vibe. You're gonna get a very big percentage of that sound. And with the Ebony fingerboard, you're gonna get a very big percentage of that feel, to be quite honest with you. You've got American electronics here. You've got Gibson pickups. They're the same pickups between both models. You're not even sacrificing that. There's a lot of guitar to be had here. And on stage, you know, only us guitar players are gonna pay attention to the fact that this is an Epiphone in the first place. I think most of your general crowd just gonna see this sort of silhouette of the double bound body on stage with the binding and the gold hardware and the black. And, you know, even now the headstock shape is so similar between the two that it's hard to argue, you know, that it's that inferior of a guitar when, quite frankly, you know, you're getting probably 80, I'm just gonna throw a number out, 85% of the Gibson Les Paul Custom for 25%-ish of the price, right? So that's a pretty good return on investment as far as money spent, guitar had. But does any of that matter if these things don't play good or sound good? Does any of that matter if these don't stack up tonally? So that's what we're gonna find out right now. Let's get to playing these things and see what happens. All right, gang. So the consensus, at least in my opinion, is this is a lot of guitar for me. This is, like I said, this is my, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but the black Les Paul Custom is sort of my dream ideal guitar. It's double humbucker, which I prefer for whatever reason. It's got elegant lines. It's got elegant curvature. And even though it's black, all of this binding all the way around the guitar still helps it stand out against your body and on stage, because you can see the entire silhouette of the guitar even under, you know, stage lighting or that sort of thing. I've had burst guitars that were sort of darker around the edges, and under stage light it almost looks like I'm playing a banjo, because all you see is just the burst in a fretboard. You don't really see the rest, you know, even bound. Anyway, that being said, if I were to lose this guitar, right, it would devastate me. But I would take a little bit of solace in the fact that I could get, for a fraction of the price, most of that mojo back until I was able to maybe work my way back up to this, or maybe even not. Maybe I wouldn't want to worry about one of those getting stolen again, which I wouldn't want this to get stolen either. But considering the amount of Les Paul Custom that you get with this, I think it's absolutely worth every single penny of that $12.99. Now, both of these, of course, come with a hard shell case. Again, full disclosure, mine is that brown case over there because it is an earlier 2013, 2014 model. Now they're going to come with a black case that has that sort of goldenrod interior, similar to what you would have seen in a late 60s Les Paul Custom, for example. Or even, you know, sort of what you see the SG reissues now come with, the early 60s SG reissues. This one is going to come with that case as well. It is going to be a slightly different variant of that case. You're going to, if you looked at them both side by side, you would tell which one is the Epiphone and which one is the Gibson, not just because they say as such on the, you know, outside of the case, but just the feel, the type of interior they use. I don't think one's worse or better than the other. I just think they're just different from one another enough to be able to tell. Again, you're getting a ton of guitar for that amount of money. I would not hesitate 1 second to take this out and play it instead of that guitar on any day of the week. I just think this guitar is really just, I'm really glad Epiphone came out with this guitar. I've wanted a black custom forever, and I think this is a great alternative to someone who, like me, even as a boy up through most of my adult life, I have, you know, pined for a Gibson Les Paul Custom. And now you can put a whole lot of that in somebody's hands that can afford it, or that is at, you know, that's their price point, right? But anyway, gang, I digress. This is a cool guitar. That's a cool guitar. They stack up very well against one another. I will say this. The Epiphone probably needs a setup out of the box. At least this example does. The action's not really my favorite. Might be your favorite. Not my favorite. So the playability out of the box could probably use a little bit of tweaking, but setting up guitars is really always to taste anyway, unless it's just so high that it's unplayable, which this is not. So if you get one of these, just keep in mind you may want to do just a little bit of a setup on it, but for that amount of, you know, money that a setup costs, or if you do it yourself, it's every bit worth it. Anyway, gang, I'm gonna get back to it out here. Thank you guys a ton for watching. Again, like and subscribe if you like the MME content. Check us out online on Facebook. Check out Haas's Antics on TikTok and on the YouTube shorts here on the channel. And of course, check us out on Instagram, and check us out at mountainmusicexchange.com. Check out that new arrival section where you can see all the latest new and used gear that is updated daily. As soon as we get them traded in, we try and put them on there ASAP. So, gang, thank you all a ton. I'm Clay. You rock. And I'm going to steal Kevin's line from some of the Facebook videos for this one. Wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, make it loud. See you, gang.